Well, thank you very much. And when I first started thinking about this topic, building career and industry-sponsored projects, I thought there were two ways we could go. One was to think about, well, if you only want to do industry-funded studies, and that's certainly one way to think about how you might build your career over time. And I certainly have many colleagues who've done really important, very impactful industry-funded studies, and that's been the basis of their career, and they've done very well for many, many years. But I think all of us would rather think about building a career in industry-funded studies as having this as a foundation, and then finding out or figuring out a way to use this to build into using additional research awards, NIH awards, for example. And this more mimics my career, and I'll share some personal insights with you as we move forward. Here are my disclosures. And on my disclosures, I think it does show you that, yes, I do have industry support and I have NIH support. And I'll show you a little bit about how we accomplish this. To start with, I think it's also important to recognize where is the funding, because at the end of the day, a lot of this comes down to money. And this slide demonstrates that total research expenditure is quite large. You'll see that federal expenditure that we've heard about that we're all trying to obtain is quite substantial as well, $30 to $40 billion. But industry funds a significant amount of U.S. medical and health research in the United States. This is data from fiscal year 2012. I looked at my home state, and by the way, if you ever need any kind of statistics, this Research America, which is a lobbying group, has really good data there. All your states are listed, so if you ever need information for preliminary grants, et cetera, you can find it there. So I looked at my home state of North Carolina, and you see that federal government funds about $2.2 billion worth of health-related research, and industry, $4.7 billion, so almost double, more than double, what's actually being spent in North Carolina from industry than it is from federal government. Of course, we have large research institutions in North Carolina as well, and you see the state ranking. So number 13 in industry funded, number 17 overall in federal government research funding here. I think also that the availability of research funds and who we're going to think about applying for somewhat varies by your subject matter. And I think for basic scientists, and this is some data from the National Science Foundation and how they categorize science, but basic science, where activities aimed at acquiring new knowledge or understanding without a specific immediate commercial application or use, so basic science, if you will. Most of that is done at U.S. research institutions, and a lot of that, actually the vast majority, is actually funded by the federal government. But when you start thinking about translational research, clinical research, then you see where the business sector can actually drive a large amount of that type of funding as well. I won't dwell on these NIH funding levels. We've seen that over time the NIH funding levels have been relatively flat, although we hope they're going to go up with some of the new budget negotiations. And because of this, because of the increase of people applying for the awards, as well as the flat funding, overall the pay lines for particularly the R awards and other program projects, et cetera, has fallen down to the 15 to 20% level. Now, I'm not showing this to be discouraging. What I'm showing this is to make everybody realize that there are other sources of funding, and we should be very optimistic to keep our eyes open to find other potential sources. Now, we may ask ourselves, why is there even a distinction between industry-funded and NIH-funded research? And I think some of the discussion here has suggested that. We've talked about promotions and things like that. So I think there is an underlying distinction that's given at major research institutions in this regard. In 2014, the NIH delivered about $30 billion to 50,000 competitive grants at over 2,500 universities in the U.S. But why do we think a little bit differently about industry-funded research? Well, there is some perception of stature. And top research universities are ranked by the amount of NIH dollars. There are always lists, whether it's similar to like the U.S. News and World Report. You can pull up, go on the internet and try to find out where your university is ranked in terms of NIH dollars. And that's very important for a lot of reasons as shown here. There's also perhaps some perception of value, and it may come down to dollars and cents. The overhead that for every dollar spent in your research study that ultimately gets returned to the institution is almost double that. 50 to 60% of the grant actually gets returned to the institution to cover what's overhead cost. Industry-funded studies, maximum usually about 28 to 30%. And then there's this also perception of purity that I think we have to overcome a little bit. But there's a lot of information out there that suggests that industry-funded studies are usually positive. They're usually the things that are cited heavily because they've demonstrated a positive result. And to get around this, of course, we have clinicaltrials.gov now, where you have to register any study that you're doing to try to prevent publication bias and demonstrate that even if you have negative study results, those are going to be available somewhere to people to investigate. But I also recognize that perhaps it may not just be bias. It may also be that industry in some ways is making smarter choices. They're liable, or they have to be responsible to shareholders, to their corporate board, et cetera. And they're obligated to make smart choices. They don't want to invest a ton of money going down a rabbit hole of research that's not going to yield things that we hope ultimately will improve health outcomes. So there are two ways to look at this. If you're a pessimist, you're going to say it's all biased. But if you're an optimist, you're going to say, well, they're also making good choices. Now, at the end of the day, where you're trying to find funding somewhat comes down to economics. And as NIH funding starts to decrease, or that the pay lines are relatively low, and industry funding is putting a lot of money into these phase 2, phase 3, phase 4 clinical trials, universities are going where the money is. And every one of your institutions, I guarantee you, when NIH funding was starting to be a little bit more difficult to obtain, created very focused efforts to attract more industry dollars, tried to improve research efficiency, develop new investigators for industry-funded studies, and overall attempts to decrease the barriers that industry would feel by doing studies at research institutions that some of us have to deal with on a daily basis, some of that frustration. It reminds me of that old story. There was that, it might be apocryphal, but the bank robber, when they asked him at his sentencing why did he rob banks, he said, well, that's where the money is. So the idea is that that's where we want to go to if the money is there. So there are several ways that you can get involved in industry-funded studies. We have investigator-initiated studies, and these are things where there's mutual interest between the potential funding source, the industry, whatever company that may be, and what you're doing, either in your lab or from your clinical research. And it can be basic science or clinically patient-oriented research. And here, in investigator-initiated studies, the investigator develops the idea, writes the protocol, pitches it to industry, and they may review it, and industry liaisons may suggest modifications. And I think we have to recognize that there are a lot of smart people working in industry. Actually, most of them came from academia and ultimately migrated to industry. They're rather intelligent. They're very focused on their field. And they often can make very good suggestions in modifying some of your investigator-initiated studies. But what's important here is that the investigator owns the data, and they own the analyses, and they own the publications. Okay? The only deliverables that you have to the company are just making sure that it's actually getting done, that they may set some timelines for IRB approval, making sure it gets listed on clinicaltrials.gov, defining when the study is going to be completed, what your patient accrual milestones are. So those are the kinds of deliverables that you negotiate for an investigator-initiated study. You may provide them with a courtesy review of the manuscript, and it's purely out of courtesy. They have no editorial control over investigator-initiated studies, and that's spelled out in the contracts that your institution will do with the sponsors. Most pharma sponsors, big pharma, small pharma, actually welcome IIS proposals. They often have mechanisms on their websites that you can find what areas of research that they're particularly interested in that dovetails with their interests. And they also provide quick review and funding decisions, which is really nice. And I think this is key. This is really important and useful for developing preliminary data for NIH grants. You can do it fairly quickly, and it's a good source of funding to keep in mind. The other way you can get involved in industry-funded research is the classic clinical trials, right, where they're testing drugs in different disease states that you're seeing in your practice. Here, the pharma sponsor contracts with the PI and actually the university to perform the specific clinical trial. The deliverables here are way different. It's regulatory rigor, it's patient enrollment, it's your obligation to closely monitor those patients, keep them safe during the course of the clinical trial, and provide them with clean and accurate data according to good clinical practice standards. Here, all the data is owned by the sponsor. But what are the opportunities that you might think about if you're involved in phase 1 to 4 clinical industry-sponsored research? Well, there's networking. You get to meet a lot of other PIs at investigator meetings who are like-minded as you, interested in doing things. That can lead to other collaborations. You can start to develop your own research infrastructure because the money, the funding that you get from industry sponsors, of course, can pay research coordinators, research assistants, research techs, start to fund a serum bank and things like that. There is the potential for high-impact publications. We'll talk about some examples. You can consider proposing ancillary studies from the data that's already being collected from the phase 1 to 4 clinical trials. And also important when you're thinking about grant applications is that it allows you to develop experience, a track record, and learn more about good clinical practices. And good clinical practices is kind of described here. It's really the roadmap that we follow as clinical investigators that assures that our research participants are being cared for, that all their rights, the safety, and their well-being are protected within the standards of GCP. Whether from the beginning of the design of the clinical trial to conducting it, to monitoring it appropriately, recording, analyzing the data, making sure it's accurate, reporting it out in manuscripts, that all falls under GCP. And industry studies do quite a good job at following GCP. And if you can learn GCP in the context of clinical trials and industry-funded studies, it will tremendously help all your own investigator-initiated studies or your grant applications, because everything that's applicable to GCP is absolutely applicable. Everything we heard about writing NIH grants. So another way is, let's say you're participating in a multi-center phase 3 clinical trial. They're collecting great clinical data. They're collecting biospecimens. And you're thinking, okay, how can I tap into that a little bit more, not just enroll patients? What else can I do? Well, think about proposing an investigator-initiated translational study. Okay, so maybe you have some specific lab expertise that you can take those samples, those highly linked clinical data, really detailed clinical data, apply a unique aspect from your lab, and generate some very interesting preliminary data for grants or manuscripts, et cetera. The other way you can think about it is there are a lot of secondary endpoints that kind of go unexplored in these clinical trials. Other ways to mine these large clinical databases. And I'll tell you that you can utilize your clinical research expertise, and that industry is very receptive to these kinds of proposals to say, hey, let's see what we can do with these. Well, there are some disadvantages to working in industry-funded studies that you have to think about. We talked a little bit about perception. This perception also filters down that it may have a little bit less impact on promotion compared to NIH awards, and I'll be interested in hearing other people's thoughts about that. They're often short-term funding. They're also study-specific funding, so they may only last for a year, maybe 2 at a time. And you have to, if you're planning on doing IIS studies, investigator-initiated studies, the investigator research agenda has to align with the potential sponsor studies. So that's, or their priorities, so that's one thing. But there are advantages as well. There's rapid startup, talking about weeks. It pays for your clinical research infrastructure to get started. Start with coordinators, your tech, things like that. Start your specimen bank that you can use from some of this funding. It helps you develop that track record that I mentioned that ultimately can be used and leveraged for federal funding. Residual funds is a term that other institutions call other things, but if you have any money left over from an industry trial, after you've paid all your bills, after you've paid your coordinator, paid for your salary support, everything else, most institutions will allow you to use that for other academic pursuits and how you can fund other academic things of interest to you, whether it's pilot studies or, again, paying for your research infrastructure. And there's a potential for high-impact publications we shouldn't underestimate. There's a whole field of study that looks at what are the impactful scientific journals, what are the impactful manuscripts in various fields of study. It's interesting. They, I guess, make their own academic career studying the impact of other people's academic career. Okay, let's do it. And this came out in 2015, and this is the top cited GI and hepatology articles published in all journals, okay, as you see here, ranked 1 to 50. And you'll see that the top 1 to 5, these are top 5 journals. 4 of the 5 were actually funded by industry, and I'll say that the number 5 is PEG interferon alpha 2A plus ribavirin. I was the first author on the New England Journal manuscript, and this really set the stage for the standard of care for hepatitis C for at least a decade until the direct-acting antiviral agents came out. And this was an industry-funded study that had a wide-ranging impact on my career, led to a lot of ancillary studies, led to a lot of other things. So how else how can NIH studies, how could industry studies help NIH study achieving grant success with NIH-funded studies? Well, you've seen this, the 5 pillars of how your grant gets reviewed: significance, innovation, approach, investigator, and environment. And I think there are 2 areas where this may play a role. Particularly if you're an early-stage investigator, you can think about where they ask, do they have the appropriate experience and training? Well, you can show, if you're doing industry studies, that yes, you've developed experience, you've developed a track record of enrolling patients, you've learned about good clinical practice from these industry studies that can only help, particularly if you're thinking about clinical research, or if you've done IAS studies relative to industry and spin-off studies from that. And similarly, the environment. The industry studies can help enrich your environment, as I said, by creating and helping maintain your research infrastructure while you're in between grants or waiting for additional grants. So if we think about how we pursue NIH funding, right, if we think that this is the ultimate NIH award that we're trying to, whatever type of award you're thinking about, we go through kind of a set process that we've heard a lot about today. We brainstorm this idea. We have to come up with some preliminary data to show that we're serious about it. We write this innovative application that also includes a way to highlight our track record. And sometimes there are some barriers along the way that we may have. Maybe our track record might be a little thin if we were only focusing on this one grant. So I think there are ways that industry can help. You can see where industry investigator-initiated studies can help you with preliminary data. You can see where the clinical trials experience, GCP, enrolling patients, developing an important cohort that you're subsequently going to study in your NIH grant can be important. And the same thing goes for investigator-initiated studies with samples, specimens, translational research, et cetera. And I can help remove those barriers. This just gives you an example. Early on in my career, when I was just applying for funding for various awards, these things were important in preliminary data citing, in cited preliminary data. Industry studies, clinical trials that we were doing, some interferon signaling studies that were interferon investigator-initiated studies. And then subsequently, we were able to start, of course, as you were acquiring more NIH grants, you start citing those more. But industry studies and investigator-initiated studies always form some role in successful grant applications over the years. Now, this is really important, okay? You got to think about your research career as your portfolio. Any of you pay any attention to your portfolio at your young age? You know, I remember there are people in residency who were reading the newspaper every morning looking at their stock portfolios. And now I'm realizing they were the smart ones, okay? Because they're probably retired. They may not have published as many papers as I have, but they're probably retired by now. By the way, they didn't have smartphones. They were really looking at the stock changes in the newspaper. But you know that your portfolio changes over time. You might take higher risk when you're younger, less bonds, more stocks, a little more volatile. And your investment portfolio changes over time, where you may be a little bit more conservative and less stocks and more bonds around the age of retirement. Well, I think the same lessons apply to your research. You want to diversify your research portfolio in order to minimize risk and maximize your returns. And early on, your research may come from, very early in your career, may come from pilot awards. And I think, as I showed you, industry can play a role in this. We talked about some of the important pilot awards and funding opportunities from FAASLD and AGA, and there are a lot of other foundation grants that you could think about applying for. A little later in your career, but still early, you still have some industry background there, but then you've been successful, K23, K08s, taking 75% of your time, you still have a little industry and maybe other foundation awards. And then subsequently, over time, you can still think about having industry studies, but you've been successful now with independent research awards, R01s, U01s, and a fantastic grant, which you should keep in mind in the future, is the K24. That is a mid-career mentoring award and allows you to help mentees at your institution. So I think if you try to diversify your research portfolio over time, you might have the most benefit. So what are the keys to being successful in this endeavor? Well, you want to get your foot in the door. Ask your mentor to make some introductions for you. And don't be afraid to pound the pavement, okay? You can wear out some shoe leather doing this. And I will tell you, the first industry grant that I got was directly because I was a new faculty member at Emory in 1998. I knew I wanted to do some industry-funded studies, and at my own expense, I flew up to BMS, met with the medical director, and explained to them who I was, where I was, very interested in industry studies and clinical trials, and that led to some subsequent funding opportunities. So don't be afraid to try to make these opportunities for yourself. Respond to invitations and requests in a timely manner. We're all really busy, but if someone is reaching out to you, don't ignore them. And prioritize study performance. You want to develop a reputation for clinical research excellence. Embrace GCP. Some of it sounds a little cumbersome, but it's really an important cornerstone for clinical trials. Your research staff is going, if you have this commitment, your research staff will mimic that same level of commitment, and it will help you tremendously. Focus on study startup times. It's an important metric that industry does look at on awarding you additional studies. Cast a wide net. Keep your eyes open. Look for opportunities. Make opportunities. Be aware of the changing research environment in your chosen field. Obviously, if you're just starting out today and you wanted to study hepatitis C therapeutics, that may not be the best career choice at the moment. I'm thinking NASH may be a little bit better. And also, you have to moderate your concern for being overextended, right? All these grants say 75% protected time, but as John showed at the earliest yesterday, that 75% is a little nebulous how you characterize it. So you have to be willing to cast a wide net and work on other things, because at the end of the day, if your K award doesn't work out, you still want other things to pick up the slack. Be patient but persistent. Submit investigator-initiated study ideas to medical science liaisons that all the companies have, and network with medical directors. Tell them that you're interested in opportunities to be in writing groups. Like I said, they want interested, dedicated investigators. And you never know, it could lead to one of the highest impact publications in your field. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm happy to take any questions as part of the panel. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to have a panel for just about 10 minutes. That's all we have. So if the previous speakers, David, Rhonda, Hashim, Nick can come up. So I thought that was an excellent talk, and understanding that was great. So I'll start off with a question just to kick things off. So this is for David. Just for our audience, are awards from industry or the NIH made to individuals, or who are they made out to?
So they're made to your institution. So you put your application package together, and your institution submits it on your behalf. And we interact with your institutional grants management office, really. I mean, I can have one-on-ones with you, of course, as well, but for official documents or anything like that, it goes through the official channels, and the award is made to the institution. Okay.
And perhaps for Michael, same thing for industry?
Yes, the awards are made to the institution. They're the ones who administer it for you, but of course you have to sign off as the PI. Yeah.
Nice moment there.
Such ham.
Michael?
A question for David. We're seeing, of course, a desire to have more academic women participate, and the K Award happens at a time when, biologically, some women will want to have their children, their families. We had an experience where a young investigator had taken 3 years to have her 2 children, sort of academic leave, and then came back in the system. And then the time clock had ticked too far, and then she was no longer eligible to be a K awardee. Is that something that we can work on so that we can continue to encourage women to be able to participate in the Career Development Awards?
I don't know about other institutes, but I can say, at least for NIDDK, that the time out away from the research would, typically we would look at it and it wouldn't be held accountable. I mean, part of the clock. It's really the time at the bench or in the clinic doing the research. The K01 is the only mechanism that explicitly states a time range post-terminal degree, 2 to 5 years. K08 and K23 actually don't state that. So our heuristic is we would like you towards the end of your K period to still have ESI, early investigator status, so that you get that bump in the pay line when you go for your R01. So in general, no, that if you took time away from the bench, we wouldn't hold that against you.
Okay. we actually had a situation where the staff people at the NIH said exactly what you said now, and then it went to study section, and the reports, so the reviews were entirely, this person is 8 years out of medical school, finished fellowship so many years ago. So it may be something that I'd ask to look at the details and make sure we can implement it.
Yeah, that's important. So just as a follow-up to the question, because you alluded to, can you mention about the early investigator status? Because I don't think anyone's talked about that. What makes you eligible and what makes you ineligible when you go from a K to an R?
It's simple. It's a clock. So it's 10 years post-terminal degree. So PhD or MD PhD at the end of your final degree. And it's regardless of how much clinical time you're doing and so forth, it's really 10 years. If you're beyond that point, I'll say what it means in a second, but if you're beyond that point, you can apply for sort of an extension. There's a formal process, but it has to be due to things like, you were away from doing all research because of family and things like that. And they can look at that and extend it. So what does it mean? It means having ESI status is fantastic when you're going for R01s and so forth. Because, for example, for this year, for fiscal year 2016 for NIDDK, we published this. It's in my slide set, actually, if you look at the end. The pay line for R01s is 13%. But if you're an ESI, early stage, it's 18%. It's a 5% bump, and that's significant. So it's something you don't want to trifle with losing before you're going for your R01.
Can you clarify the new investigator versus ESI?
Yeah, so a new investigator is you basically have never had a RPG as a PI. So you've never been listed as a PI or a multi-PI on a significant large grant. That's an R01, a PO1, for example. The smaller grants, R03s, K awards, those do not adulterate your new investigator status.
And what break do you get as a new investigator?
None.
Right.
So in Michael's talk, he mentioned about the what could be the impact, or he wanted to get information on the impact of industry funding for promotion. I don't know if anyone wants to make a comment on that. So in other words, NIH rankings at institutions are determined by how much NIH dollars come in per year to the whole institution. And at least historically, that getting an R01 or having an R01, it was a criteria for promotion. So what about industry sponsors for that?
One thing that is, detrimental, if you would, is that it is hard to get on the authorship of industry studies unless you're really engaged, active, as you mentioned, have a close relationship or have medical directors buy in. Participating in an industry study, you're lucky if you're in the back of the paper in the acknowledgement section. So one could have millions of dollars in funding, but no publication out of those. So lack of publication is what will negatively affect the promotion. If you have the same amount of funding and you get a New England Journal paper, I don't think that you get a significant knock because you derive your funding from industry.
Yeah, I would agree. At our institution, it's been much more accepted that if someone has, a $500,000 grant or $1 million grant from industry, as long as that's identified and they're publishing, that's hasn't been a big knock. At our institution, we also have groups we call clinical scholars and how we promote them too. So it might be what category you're in.
And for K awardees, the mentors have to have significant funding. It doesn't have to be current R01 funding. It just has to be significant. It can be other sources. It just has to be real, and they still have to have demonstrated a strong mentoring track record.
And David, on that same thing, you mentioned a loan repayment program. You didn't mention if they have to have a grant or not.
It doesn't hurt. So yeah, we look at everything case by case, but being on a T32 is very good. Having an individual F is better. Having a K is best. But that's not the only parameters we look at. Publication record in your field. We just want to make sure you're not going to take the money and bolt 2 years and do something completely off of the NIDDK reservation. So we just want to make sure that you're really committed to doing research, you're not going to go into private practice.
And is there a payback provision?
2 years for the 2-year funding period.
I'll just say that's one of the most innovative things, and we've had mentees who've benefited tremendously from that loan repayment program. It's really fantastic. So it's, you should all be applauded for that, and it's really important. And I wish we had it when I was doing it.
I echo that. My own personal bias is that medical school debt is one of the major impediments to people choosing an academic career. And this is a game changer. $35,000 for 2 years, you can renew it a couple of times. I mean, that is a significant help.
And it may get better because there's talk that it probably will go up to 50,000 a year.
Oh, that's great. 35 to 50, it's great.
It's great.
I almost want to go back to medical school. So Hashim mentioned PCORI grants. Are PCORI grants counted in as NIH grants? I know the answer. I'm asking you guys.
Yes, I certainly believe they are. I think they're federally awarded grants, so I think they sort of fall in that same category.
Yeah, I agree with you, but they actually don't, at least from my understanding, they don't count towards the institution's NIH funding.
Oh.
So they're federal grants, but if what you get directly from NIH counts towards your NIH ranking, but PCORI, because it's outside of that, is technically doesn't count toward that. That's what I understand, unless I'm wrong.
There's a question.
A question.
I'm still confused about eligibility. So it's either 10 years after your terminal degree or within 5 years after you finish clinical training?
Are you talking about ESI status?
Yes.
It's 10 years. Yeah. You can send me an email. I can show you the
So I think that you might be some confused. There's 2 different things. There's early investigator status, or whatever it's called, early stage investigator, and then there's the new investigator when you apply for a very first R01.
Right.
So those are 2 different things. Let's see, other questions from the audience? You guys understand everything now?
I think they're hungry.
Well, I think I want to thank everybody, including the mentors who took time out of their day. So I really appreciate everybody. And